Ladies and gentlemen, good evening. My name's Nick Battler. I chair the King's Policy Institute here. It's a great pleasure to welcome you, and it's my privilege to chair this third lecture in our series in our program on Europe in Crisis, a third lecture by Professor Dominique Moisi, who's our visiting professor this year. And he is going to talk tonight about fear in the Middle East. Dominique.
Thank you. Well, this is the third lecture. The first one was an introduction to so-called triumph of fear in the present-day world. Last lecture was a comparison between Western fears and Asian fears. And now I'm moving to the Middle East with deliberate ambiguity. Middle Eastern fears. Does it mean fears that are felt by people who live in the Middle East, or does it mean people outside of the Middle East who are afraid of what's happening in the Middle East? And in the course of the lecture, I will cover probably the two subjects. But I think the best starting point for this lecture would probably be the evolution of thinking about the so-called Arab Spring. When events started to take place, first in Tunisia, then in Egypt, and then they spread further to other countries which have known different histories since then, there was a feeling that the right comparison was with the spring of people, which is the revolution that took place in 1848 in Europe. The formula was coined by an Arab thinker himself. And in his mind, there were two reasons why one should compare the events unfolding in the Arab world with the spring of people of 1848 in Europe. One reason, the first one, was of a technological nature. In 1848 in Europe, the telegraph had played a decisive role. People took to the streets in Venice or Frankfurt or Vienna, learning through the telegraph that Paris had once again erupted. And in the Arab world, the key instruments were, of course, new instruments of communication, from mobile phone to Twitter and other channels of modern communication, guiding people to Tahrir Square, telling them where to be and how to do it. But of course, beyond the technological dimension, there was an element of hope. The feeling that at long last, the Arab world was coming out of his age of glaciation, that suddenly things were moving. And you could read in the articles written by Arab thinkers and Orientalists, Western specialists of the Arab world, this argument that the Arab world was coming to terms with modernity, that the Middle East was joining in the process of globalization. And the reason that were given immediately were as follows. There was first the encounter between demographic and economic realities. The largest generation of the so-called Arab baby boomers were coming to the work market at the very time the consequences of the financial economic crisis of the West were starting to be felt in the Arab world. So there were more people and less jobs. Qualified people whose diploma was worthless, precisely because there were no jobs for qualified people. And the other logic was the encounter between political and ethical dimension. The ethical dimension was singled out as the most important one. Was not only the fact that leaders were despotic, that was rejected, but it was the fact that not only they were autocratic, not only they were incompetent, but they were deeply corrupt. I was told by a close Tunisian friend, I can't prove the story is true, that on his last day in power, Ben Ali in Tunisia made a phone call to his closest advisor. He had given a talk on Tunisian television and had said, once again, calm down, just return, we will look at the situation, I promise reforms are going to take place. And the people ignored that last speech. No one was listening to him, and people were marching in very large number towards the presidential palace, and the army was remaining neutral. And the closest advisor of President Ben Ali said, well, it's too late, but if there was one thing you could do, it would be to divorce from the Trabelsi family and from the image of corruption that is surrounding your power. And the same situation took place in Egypt. The same situation started to take place in Syria. And so there was a feeling that at long last, the wall of fear was crumbling. That a culture dominated by humiliation had been so dominated by that humiliation that suddenly they couldn't take it any longer, and that normalcy was going to prevail. Why can't we be like others? Was the motto of the Arab Spring. But why am I using the Arab Spring expression to start a lecture on Middle Eastern fears? Precisely because there has been since the movement started 3 years ago, nearly today, an evolution in the thinking about the meaning, the direction, the consequences of what is happening in the Middle East. And one has moved from the concept of the Arab Spring to the use of the expression the Islamist winter, as if the climatic atmosphere had dramatically changed from hope to fear. And to some extent today we are in what people are describing as a third phase, which is not the Arab Spring, not the Islamist winter, but more like the breaking down of a geographic order created by colonial power at the time when the Ottoman Empire was about to collapse. Aren't we entering a phase of fragmentation of the Middle East as it is, with consequences of an immense nature, not only for the region, but for other regions? If countries like Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Libya starts to multiply, what will be the impact on the African continent next door? The African continent has boundaries which are as artificial as the boundaries of the Middle East. The famous line in the sand drawn by two diplomats, Sykes, a British one, Picot, a French one, in 1916, based in some ways in the imagination and Machiavellian calculus of people who wanted to divide the Ottoman Empire not for the good of the people living there, but for their own benefits. And in fact, it's important to remember that initially there was a part of the Ottoman Empire that was going to go to Russia. It was not only the French and the British who were going to share the spoils of the Ottoman Empire, but was going to be the Russian Empire, which was allied with the French and the British against the Central Powers. Of course, revolution took place in Russia. Russia became the Soviet Union, and the Soviet Union was not invited to the pie of the Western powers. But there is that sense that, and I think it's interesting, because it starts the Arab Spring with the vision that at long last they are joining us in our values. They're going to be like us, they are like us. And this was the Zoom effect of the Tahrir Square demonstration. The Zoom effect. We looked through CNN, through Al Jazeera, through the BBC, at what was happening in Tahrir Square. And what we saw were people who looked exactly like us, who reacted like us, who behaved like us. And so the conclusion was, they are joining us. They could no longer accept the lack of democracy, the lack of the rule of law. They wanted to lead a normal life. And now, 3 years later, people are saying, but it's just the reverse that is taking place. It's not that they so much want to become like us. Could it be that the end result is that what we draw on the sand, what we decided when we created artificially these nation states, is simply disappearing in front of our eyes. And as a result, suddenly there is another reading, which is nothing changes. When we start doing something, it can only fail. And you can see that there is that sense of doom and gloom that is seizing part of the Arab intellectuals. What is happening to us? Can't we do something right? And this sense of doubt, self-doubt, meets with what I would call a deep culture of humiliation. A feeling that today, like yesterday, the destiny of the Arab world is fixed by other nations, other culture. A feeling that you are not in control of your own destiny. And if we look back in gross terms to the history of the relationship between the West and the Middle Eastern cultures and Middle Eastern realities, which may be Ottoman in their identity or post-Ottoman, as we've seen in the 20th century, there is that lingering sense of being dispossessed of one's history. The great historian of the Ottoman Empire, Bernard Lewis, emphasized the importance of the naval battle of Abu Qir in 1796 for the destiny and the soul of the region. The fate of Egypt was decided for more than a century by the result of a naval fight between British fleets and French fleet. The Arabs had nothing to do with it. The Ottomans, who were not Arabs on the top, had nothing to do with it. It was decided above their head, like the Sykes-Picot Agreement, or for that matter, like the creation of the State of Israel between 1947 and 1948, the peak of a culture of humiliation, with a sense that history is pushing us down at any steps. 1453, the world is up for grabs. Constantinople has been seized by the Ottomans. 1571, Levante, just the reverse. The Christian Republic takes its revenge, again on sea. 1683, the Ottoman Empire failed to seize Vienna. And from that moment on, it has been constant decline. And I think this is felt much more in the Arab world than in the non-Arab parts of the Middle East. From that standpoint, the case of Turkey, the case of Iran are different because they feel the direct inheritors of great civilization and great empire, with a sense that greatness was not that far away. Greatness was still there at the end of the 19th century for the Ottomans. And the sign, the symbol of the legacy of the Persian culture are to be seen everywhere, up to India. And so gives them a sense of pride, because it was not that long ago. In the case of the Arab world, I mean, I do remember very well the sense of, in fact, the world falling upon them as a result of the Six-Day War, when the inheritors of the slave of Pharaoh defeated in less than a week the inheritors of the Pharaoh themselves. How could they do it? And of course the reason was technologically very simple to understand. But so there is that first fear. We can't do it. We can't do it again. Linked to a second fear, which is that those who are going to benefit from the situation are not those who started the events. And here I come, of course, to the various interpretations which one can derive from the evolution of the situation. What has really happened in the Middle East in the last 3 years? What is the right kind of analogy? I think the most open, the most generous, and I would still say the wisest analogy is with the French Revolution. Meaning that what has happened is the encounter between the accidental and the ineluctable. That is what a revolution is. And the great historian of the French Revolution, François Furet, used to write that the French Revolution started in 1789, but ended in reality in 1875, 76, when the very idea of the Republic was finally accepted by the French. So it took a century to get to the real meaning of what had happened in 1789. If that is the case, we have to be extraordinarily prudent. We are only, in comparative terms, in 1793. The revolution is a baby. What seems to reinforce the analogy with the French Revolution is what is happening in Egypt. Because in Egypt, to a large extent, what we have seen is the triumph, for the moment, of a counter-revolution. The army had to give in, to abandon the Mubarak family, then to give in, to accept an electoral process. But that electoral process brought to power a regime perfectly legitimate, perfectly legal, who proved itself to be at the same time incompetent and intolerant. And then a coup d'etat took place. But you can say, in retrospect, that the army had never accepted to lose its privilege, and therefore was waiting for an opportunity, calculating the time it would take for the Islamist regime to fail. The second analogy for the events which are taking place in front of our eyes is of a darker nature. One doesn't go to the French Revolution. One goes to the religious wars which dominated the Europe of the mid-16th, mid-17th centuries. Just replace Catholic and Protestant with Sunni and Shiite. And you have the logical explanation for what's happening. It's not so much that the Islamists are taking over. It is that there is a war within Islam, which makes, of course, the opening of Barack Obama to the Arab world in his famous speeches from Cairo to Istanbul slightly anachronistic. The moment he says to the Arabs, wanting to close the tragedy of 9/11 and its repercussions on the relationship between the West and the world of Islam, he says, I don't want war between me and you. But the you is at war with itself. There is a war within the House of Islam which is engulfing the region. Then there is a third analogy to which I alluded to en passing, which is, of course, the Balkans. We are about to see in the Middle East, in the coming years, a multiplication of new states. Something like Kurdistan, which will combine the Kurds from Iraq, the Kurds from Syria, which are already totally autonomous, with, of course, a major challenge for former empires like Turkey or Iran. So, to summarize, you have three kinds of fear which are specifically dominating the Arab part of the region. The fear of not being able to make it again. The fear that the past, in its heritage of failure, will continue to prevail. There is the fear of religious wars. There is the fear of chaos. But there is also the fear that non-Arabs are going to benefit from the present situation. By non-Arabs, I mean Turks, Iranian, or Israelis. There is a debate in the Arab world whether the real winner of the present situation is not Israel. The Arab world is at war with itself before being at war for the Palestinians. Or there is another fear that the real winner is Iran, because suddenly the world recognized the fact that Iranian moderation is so much wanted, so much needed, that we have to accommodate the need, perceived or real, for Iranian to get to nuclear energy, supposedly for civilian use, but possibly for military use. And it's very interesting to look at the perception that seems to dominate in the three countries I've just mentioned: Turkey, Iran, and Israel. What do they fear? What do they hope for in this present conjunction? Turkey, I think when the Arab Revolution started, there was a feeling in Turkey that their time had really come, that this was the triumph of Turkey as a model and as an actor. As a model, because true, if there was a country in the region that was Muslim, that was proving that democracy and Islam, modernity and Islam, capitalism and Islam were perfectly compatible, that was Turkey. And you could see the ambivalence of Egyptians in the beginning of their revolution. Turkey was a model, but they were partly unhappy with that because it was the former Ottoman ruler and because they were not Arabs. And Turkey felt that she had specific cards to play. Erdogan, the prime minister, had excellent relationship, so he thought, with Ahmadinejad in Iran and Bashar al-Assad in Syria. And Turkey realized, with the process of time, that in fact she was much less regarded as a model and much less used as an actor. So there was a sense of frustration that prevailed in Ankara. What happened? We thought it was our time, and it was not. What did we do wrong? And of course it coincided with uprising in Turkey, with a movement on Taksim Square, which was much more like May 68 in France, than the French Revolution or the Egyptian Revolution, but which showed that the power inside was less powerful than it wanted to be. So a dual sense of frustration. In the case of Iran, I think they came to the conclusion that time was playing in their favor. that in 2003, the American, likely, without too much thinking, had given the Shiite a victory in Iraq by overthrowing the regime of Saddam Hussein. That the only winner in the region of that messy situation was Tehran. And then they saw something which can be interpreted by diplomatic historians as the equivalent in the Middle East of what happened in the 18th century in 1756, when France shifted alliance, exchanged her alliance with Prussia with an alliance with the House of Austria, with the Habsburg Empire. And in fact, there are a lot of similarities between the situation then and the situation now. Replace France by the United States. Replace the House of Austria with Iran. Replace the Arab states and Israel with the Ottoman Empire at that time, who felt deeply frustrated by what he saw as a betrayal, the reversal of alliances. But it was all good seen from Tehran. You need me, and I need you. Yes, your policy of sanction has had some impact on me, but by the end, those sanctions are hurting your interest as much as my interest. And there is a sense of confidence again in Tehran that you do not see in any Arab capital, nor in Ankara today. Then comes the complex case of Israel. To understand the attitude of Israel towards the Arab revolutions, you have to go back into the past and to consider the sense of deep isolation, which is very often a process of self-isolation of Israelis in the region. And when the revolution starts in Tunisia, in Egypt, even more so when the war, I will come back to it, starts in Syria, Israelis are caught between contradictory feelings. On the one hand, they say, well, it's good for us, as long as they are at war with each other, they will forget us a little bit. They have other things to do than to be obsessed with our existence. They never did much for the Palestinians anyway, so it's good. Then other Israelis realize that it may not be that good, that the Arab regimes, be they Mubarak in Egypt or the Assad family in Syria, were pillars of stability for the cold peace that existed in the region. Cold peace signed, ratified between Egypt and Israel, cold peace implicit between Syria and Israel. Chaos, in the end, may be bad, especially if what emerged from chaos are jihadist and more extremist people. And then, of course, there is a debate in Israel as to the nature of the true nature of the existential threat for the Hebrew state. What is the existential threat? Is it the Iranian bomb? Is it the demographic bomb? Or is it the unresolved Palestinian problems? Each case can be singled out specifically. The Iranian bomb, the fact that Israel has the bomb, is a balancer for the demographic superiority of the Arab Islamic world. They are much more numerous, but by the end of the day, we are the only one to have the bomb in the closet. That is key to our survival, and we need to be the only one to have that bomb, because the Arab world knows we're not going to use it, but if they have it, maybe one day they would, but that's the story. Others would say that the security of Israel is more threatened by the absence of legitimacy of Israel, and that the key to the legitimacy of Israel in the international arena rests upon a fair solution to the Palestinian problem. So how can you combine those two senses of legitimacy? Then I think I would like to conclude with a problem which I systematically did not touch upon, because it links with the two subjects I announced: fears within the Middle East and fear from the Middle East. And I think the best illustration of that dilemma is Syria. And I think, again, that the best analogy to understand the Western attitudes and the Western ambivalence to what's happening in Syria is the Spanish Civil War in the 1930s. Because remember the Spanish Civil War. You have the Republican side legally in power and the Franquist insurgent. The Franquist rebels are fully supported with all their energies and weapons and aviation by Nazi Germany and fascist Italy. Whereas the legal Republican regime is mildly supported by the camp of the democracies. Why are they mildly supporting the legal regime? Because beyond the legal regime in power, they see the communists, they see the anarchists, they see the Soviet Union and the threat of Soviet ambitions. Look at the Syrian situation today. The rebels are mildly, hesitantly supported by the democracies. the Bashar al-Assad regime is totally, strongly supported by Iran and Russia. And those who are left to support the rebels with their arms and money are the Arab countries of the Gulf, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, who do not discriminate between those they support. And as a result, what we have seen is within the camp of the rebels a rise of the jihadists, the most extremist, and a fall, a decline of the most moderate open forces. And as a result, suddenly we see on the battlefield the Bashar al-Assad regime regaining ground. Not enough to reunite the country as it was before, but enough to maintain itself in power. And so you see through the specific case of Syria the combination of regional fears and outside fears. What do we want? What do we expect? 3 years ago, it started as a process of normalization is finally taking place. Democracy is on the move again. 1789, 1989, 2010, the world is unified by the spirit of law and democracy. 2013, it's just the reverse. The Islamists are winning, chaos is gaining ground. What could you expect from such a region? And I think between the extreme optimism of the beginning of the process and the extreme pessimism which we are witnessing today, there is a third way, which I think is necessary. And that is to go back to the analogy of the French Revolution. We are only at the very beginning of a long and tortuous road. History has not been decided yet. And I can see my chair is looking with great severity because I have crossed the red line in terms of timing. So I stop here and it's all yours.